My son said, "You're pathetic. No wonder mom left you for Greg. Now Greg's in prison and my son wants my help." Hey, Reddit. So this is probably going to be long, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm Rick 55 male, and this whole mess started about 16 years ago when I divorced my ex-wife Tara. Our son Evan was 12 at the time, and honestly, I thought we were handling things pretty well for a split. Boy, was I wrong. The custody battle wasn't supposed to be complicated. We had agreed on joint custody initially, but then Tara decided to flip the script. Suddenly, I'm getting painted as this deadbeat dad who chose work over family. For context, I'm a civil engineer. Not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills. My job requires me to be on site for infrastructure projects, sometimes out of town for weeks at a time. It's not like I was partying in Vegas. I was literally building bridges and water treatment facilities. Tara spun this narrative in court that I was emotionally unavailable and prioritized career advancement over parenting responsibilities. Her lawyer made it sound like I was some corporate shark climbing ladders instead of a guy who worked overtime to keep our family financially stable. The judge bought into it partially, and I ended up with every other weekend plus some holidays. Then Greg showed up. This dude was everything I wasn't. Flashy car, designer clothes, always talking about his ventures and investments. Never got a straight answer about what he actually did for work, but he had money to throw around. While I was picking Evan up in my work truck, still dusty from job sites, Greg was rolling up in a BMW talking about weekend trips to ski resorts. The first red flag should have been when Evan started showing up to my place with a brand new attitude about my job. Kid used to think it was cool that I built the stuff he saw around town. We'd drive past a bridge I'd worked on, and he'd point it out to his friends. My dad built that. Made me proud as hell. I tried bringing up how he used to think my job was cool. "You used to brag to your friends about the bridges I built," I told him. He snapped back without even looking up from his phone. "Stop dwelling on the past. You're pathetic. No wonder mom left you for Greg." Then he went on about how Greg told him that successful people work from home and are always around for family. Like Greg's flexible schedule made him the gold standard of fatherhood. What really got to me was how calculated it seemed. Evan would show up for visits already in a bad mood, like someone had been feeding him reasons to be pissed off before he even walked through my door. I'd plan activities we used to enjoy together, and he'd spend the whole time talking about how much better Greg's version would be. Greg had this way of inserting himself into every conversation. I'd pick Evan up for our weekend, and Greg would walk out to the car to say hi. Always had some comment about my truck needing a wash, or how he'd just booked a vacation that sounded amazing. Real subtle stuff that made it clear he thought he was upgrading Evan's situation. I started keeping a notebook of the stuff Evan would say during visits, thinking maybe I could figure out patterns or triggers. Most of it was standard teenage attitude, but some comments were too specific to be coincidental. He'd mention things about my personality or parenting style that sounded like adult observations, not kid complaints. "You're just not really a people person, Dad," was one that stuck with me. 12-year-old Evan had never talked like that before. Sounded exactly like something Tara would say during one of our fights. Then the missed calls started. I'd call to say goodnight on weekdays, and suddenly Evan was in the shower, or doing homework, or at practice. Tara would text me these updates like she was doing me a favor, but the timing was always convenient. Too convenient. I tried talking to other divorced dads at work about it, but most of them had different situations. Either they had more cooperative ex-wives, or their kids were older when the split happened. Nobody had dealt with the systematic replacement thing I was seeing. My buddy Carlos suggested I document everything. Times when Evan seemed coached, specific things he said that didn't sound like him, patterns in his behavior. Looking back, that was probably good advice, but I was still hoping the whole thing would blow over naturally. By the time Evan turned 16, our relationship was hanging by a thread. The final gut punch came when he turned 18 and legally changed his last name from mine to Greg's. Didn't even give me a heads up. Found out when his graduation announcement showed up in the mail with Evan Morrison instead of Evan Richardson. That hit different, man. The name change felt like getting punched in the stomach while someone smiled at you. 18 years of being his father, and he replaced my name with some guy who'd known him for 6 years. I kept that graduation announcement in my desk drawer for months, just staring at his new surname like it was written in a foreign language. I kept trying for another year or so, but every attempt was met with cold shoulders or outright hostility. Phone calls went to voicemail. Texts got one-word responses or nothing. Birthday and Christmas gifts went unacknowledged. I finally realized I was fighting a war I'd already lost years ago. The breaking point was Thanksgiving. I'd cooked his favorite meal, had the table set, even bought tickets to a game I knew he wanted to see. but he never showed. After an hour, I called to ask where he was. His voice was flat, almost irritated I'd even called. I'm with my family, Rick. Dad got us better tickets. You'll be fine. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just a clear reminder that in his mind, Greg was Dad, and I was just Rick. After that, I stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped trying. What's the point of chasing someone who clearly doesn't want you around? Some might call it giving up, but I call it accepting reality. You can't force a relationship with someone who's been programmed to see you as the villain in their story. Fast forward to years of radio silence. Not a single word from Evan. No birthday calls, no Father's Day texts, nothing. I'd moved on with my life, started dating again, focused on work, built some solid friendships. Honestly, it was peaceful not constantly worrying about when the next rejection was coming. During those years, I heard bits and pieces through acquaintances about Evan's life. Graduated college with some business degree, got a job at a marketing firm, seemed to be doing well. Greg was still throwing money around, taking the family on European vacations, and buying Evan a car for graduation. From the outside, it looked like the perfect replacement family setup had worked exactly as planned. I won't lie, there were times I wondered if I'd made the right choice by backing off completely. Usually happened around holidays or when I'd see other fathers with their adult kids. But then I'd remember that last Thanksgiving, and how Evan looked at me like I was some stranger he had to tolerate, and the doubt would pass. Then, 2024 happened, and everything went sideways for Greg's little empire. Turns out all those investment opportunities and business ventures Greg was always bragging about were actually one massive contractor fraud scheme. Dude was taking deposits for construction projects, using the money to fund his lifestyle, then declaring bankruptcy when it came time to actually do the work. We're talking millions of dollars and dozens of families who lost their life savings. The whole scheme was pretty sophisticated from what I heard. Greg would target retired couples looking to renovate their homes, quote, reasonable prices to get the contract signed, then use their deposits to fund previous projects that were behind schedule. Classic Ponzi setup, except with swimming pools and kitchen remodels instead of investment returns. What made it worse was how Greg targeted specific communities. He'd get one satisfied customer in a neighborhood, then use them as a reference to land 5 more contracts on the same street. People trusted him because their neighbors vouched for him, not knowing that neighbors' project was being funded by their own deposits. The whole thing unraveled fast. Federal agents, asset seizures, the works. Greg went from BMW and ski trips to orange jumpsuit and federal prison. Karma's a hell of a thing. I'll admit I felt some satisfaction hearing the news about Greg's arrest. Not because people lost money, that part sucked for the victims, but because the guy who'd spent years acting like he was better than everyone else turned out to be a common criminal. All that flashy lifestyle was built on stealing from retirees. About a month after Greg's arrest, I got word through my sister that Tara had a stroke. The stress of the legal situation, the financial mess, the media attention, it all caught up with her. She passed away 2 weeks later without ever waking up. I'll be honest, I didn't feel much about Tara's death. Maybe that makes me cold, but she'd spent years poisoning my relationship with my son. I felt bad for Evan losing his mother, but I wasn't about to pretend we had some meaningful connection worth grieving. Then, about 3 weeks after the funeral, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. But I knew who it was before I even opened it. Hey, it's Evan. Need to ask you some questions about corporate bankruptcy and property titles. Can we talk? For the record, I'm a civil engineer, not a lawyer. But years of handling construction claims, liens, and LLC setups means I know my way around titles and contracts. Still, I hadn't exactly been offering free consultations to estranged family. There were no, how are you? No, sorry for your loss. No acknowledgement that we hadn't spoken in a decade. Just straight business. Like I was some legal consultant he'd found on Google. I stared at that text for about an hour before another one came through. Mom had some assets tied up in Greg's business. Lawyers are asking about family members who might have financial expertise. Your name came up. My name came up? After years of being erased from his life, suddenly my name was coming up because he needed something. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. More texts followed over the next few days. Questions about asset protection, bankruptcy proceedings, how to separate personal property from business assets. All written like emails from a client, not messages from a son to his father. Professional, detached, transactional. The questions got more specific as the days went on. He wanted to know about homestead exemptions, retirement account protections, whether life insurance policies could be seized in bankruptcy proceedings. Real technical stuff that showed he was in deep trouble financially. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was trying to be vindictive, but because I could see exactly what was happening. This wasn't Evan reaching out to rebuild our relationship. This was Evan reaching out because he needed free legal advice from someone with relevant experience. The texts got more frequent and more desperate as days passed. He started explaining his situation in detail. How Greg had mixed personal and business assets, how Tara's estate was tied up in the fraud case, how he was facing potential clawback lawsuits from Greg's victims. Still didn't respond. I'd learned my lesson about being someone's convenience store, only visited when they need something specific. The final text in that initial wave was the most telling. Look, I know we haven't talked in a while, but I'm in a really bad spot here. Just need some guidance on protecting what's left. A while. Years of complete silence was a while. That pretty much summed up how little our relationship meant to him. When the text didn't work, Evan escalated to phase 2, recruiting family members to guilt trip me into helping. My younger sister Melanie showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with a box of fancy pastries and that fake, cheerful smile she uses when she wants something. We'd always been close, but I could tell she was on a mission before she even stepped inside. These are from that French bakery downtown, she said, setting the box on my kitchen counter like she was delivering a peace offering. Remember how much Mom loved their croissants? We made small talk for maybe 10 minutes before she dropped the real reason for her visit. Apparently, Evan had tracked her down on Facebook and given her the full sob story about his situation. According to Melanie, he was desperate and had nowhere else to turn. Evan had been smart about his approach with Melanie. He'd started by asking about family history, wanting to know more about our parents and grandparents. Made it seem like he was genuinely interested in reconnecting with his roots, then gradually shifted to his current problems, making it sound like he just needed a little guidance from someone with experience. He seems really genuine about wanting to make things right, Melanie said, arranging the pastries on a plate like we were having some kind of formal tea party. Says he's been thinking about you a lot since his mother passed. I let her talk for a while before pointing out the obvious timeline issue. Mel, he's been thinking about me since his mother passed, which was 3 weeks ago. Before that, he spent years proving I didn't exist. You see the pattern here? She tried to play devil's advocate. Maybe he was just a confused kid influenced by his mother. Maybe he realizes now that he made mistakes. Then where's the apology? I asked. Where's the acknowledgement that he spent years treating me like garbage? His first contact was asking for business advice, not trying to make amends. Melanie had obviously prepared for this response because she immediately switched tactics, telling me about the details of Evan's current situation. Apparently, it was worse than I'd realized. Greg's fraud scheme had burned bridges with his entire extended family. When the feds seized assets, they'd taken heirloom furniture and family jewelry that belonged to Greg's relatives. Those family members were now suing anyone connected to Greg, including Evan. The legal situation was a nightmare. Greg had put Evan's name on several business accounts and property titles, supposedly to help him build credit and learn about investments. In reality, it was probably to hide assets from potential creditors. Now Evan was getting dragged into the criminal investigation as a potential co-conspirator. The kid was drowning in debt from legal fees, had lost his job due to the media attention, and was living in some studio apartment across town. He was basically starting over from scratch at 28 years old. He made his choices, I told Melanie. He chose Greg over me for long years. He chose to change his name. He chose to cut me out completely. Now he gets to live with those consequences. Melanie's cheerful mask finally slipped. So you're just going to let him spiral? You're going to watch your own son crash and burn because your feelings got hurt? My feelings got hurt? I stood up from the table. Mel, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about someone who treated me like I didn't exist for a decade, suddenly expecting me to drop everything and save him. That's not how relationships work. She gathered up her purse and left the pastries on the counter. I hope you can live with yourself if something happens to him, she said on her way out. Classic guilt trip tactic. Make me responsible for Evan's choices and their consequences. But I'd had years to process this situation, and I wasn't falling for it. 3 weeks after Melanie's visit, I got served with a subpoena. Apparently, I was being called as a witness in the civil case against Greg's fraud scheme. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake. I had zero connection to Greg's business and hadn't spoken to anyone involved in years. Then I read the details and realized what had happened. Evan had listed me as a family financial advisor who had been helping him navigate the legal complexities of the fraud case. According to his statements, we'd reconnected recently, and I was providing guidance on asset protection and bankruptcy proceedings. Basically, he'd used my name and professional background to make himself look more credible and responsible to the court. Made it seem like he had knowledgeable family support instead of being some lost kid scrambling to save his own skin. I was subpoenaed, and the attached court filings included copies of Evan's statements. Reading them was like watching someone rewrite history in real time. He claimed we'd been in regular contact since his mother's death, that I'd been instrumental in helping him understand the legal implications of Greg's fraud, and that my guidance had helped him make responsible decisions about protecting legitimate assets. None of it was true, obviously, but it painted a picture of a young man who was cooperating with authorities and getting sound advice from a qualified family member. Probably helped his case look a lot better than confused kid who signed whatever documents his criminal stepfather put in front of him. I hired a lawyer immediately because this was heading into territory where I could get dragged into someone else's legal nightmare. My attorney, Dave, was a straight shooter who'd handled a few construction disputes for my company over the years. "This is actually pretty simple," Dave said after reviewing the paperwork. "We just need to prove you had no contact with your son and no involvement in any of this. You have phone records, right? Phone records, text message logs, email history. I had everything. Years of documentation showing zero communication between me and Evan until 3 weeks ago." Dave said it was the most straightforward case of false representation he'd ever seen. The civil deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in downtown Denver. I showed up in my best suit, brought all my documentation, and prepared to set the record straight. What I wasn't prepared for was hearing the full story of how Greg had manipulated the situation during my original custody battle. One of the other witnesses was Mike Torres, Greg's former business partner who'd gotten out of the operation before it collapsed. While he was being questioned about Greg's business patterns and credibility, he brought up something I wasn't expecting. Greg used to brag about replacing fathers in his girlfriends' families. Greg specifically told me he'd convinced Tara to alienate her ex-husband during their custody battle, Mike testified. He said it was easier to control the kid without the biological father interfering. Made some joke about being an upgrade. The lawyer representing the fraud victims asked Mike to elaborate. Greg knew Tara had lied in family court about her ex-husband's involvement with their son. He went along with it because he wanted to be the only father figure in the boy's life. Said it gave him more influence over the family dynamics. Sitting there listening to this, I felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. All those years of wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a father, whether I could have tried harder, and it turns out the whole thing was orchestrated from the beginning. Mike's testimony got more detailed as the questioning continued. Apparently, Greg had a whole playbook for this kind of manipulation. He'd done similar things with previous girlfriends who had kids from earlier relationships. The goal was always to become the primary male influence by systematically undermining the biological father's relationship with the children. Greg called it strategic family restructuring, Mike said. Made it sound like some kind of business strategy instead of psychological manipulation. When it was my turn to testify, I simply presented the evidence. Phone records showing no contact, email logs with zero communication, text message history that was completely empty until Evan's recent requests for legal advice. "Mr. Richardson," the opposing attorney asked, "did you at any point provide financial or legal guidance to your son regarding this case?" "No, I did not. I haven't spoken to my son in years until he texted me 3 weeks ago asking for free legal advice." "And did you respond to those requests?" "No, I did not." The whole deposition took about 2 hours. Afterward, Dave confirmed what I already knew. I was completely clear of any involvement in the fraud case, and Evan's claims about our recent reconnection were easily disproven. But the damage was done in terms of how I viewed the situation. Evan hadn't just reached out because he was desperate. He'd actively used my name and reputation to try to improve his standing in a legal proceeding. He'd lied to lawyers and courts about our relationship status to benefit himself. That crossed a line from pathetic to unethical. A month after the deposition, I was hosting a small BBQ for some neighbors and work friends. Nothing fancy, just burgers and beers in my backyard on a Saturday afternoon. Maybe 12 people total, including a couple families with kids. I was manning the grill, talking shop with my neighbor Jim about a water treatment project we were both working on, when I heard a voice behind me that I hadn't heard in person for over a decade. "Dad?" I turned around and there was Evan, standing at my back gate with a woman I didn't recognize, and a toddler in a stroller. He looked older, obviously, but also stressed, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look exhausted. "Evan," I didn't move from the grill. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood and saw the cars. Thought maybe we could talk." The woman with him looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be there. The kid in the stroller was maybe 2 years old, blonde hair, big eyes, completely oblivious to the tension. This is Sarah, Evan said, gesturing to the woman. And this is Emma, my daughter, my granddaughter. The thought hit me weird because I'd never considered that possibility. In years of zero contact, I'd never wondered if Evan had kids, if I had grandchildren I'd never met. Sarah was clearly new to this situation. She kept looking between me and Evan like she was trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Probably got fed some sanitized version of our family history where dad was just hard to reach or busy with work. But before I could process that fully, Evan made a move that still pisses me off when I think about it. He walked over to Jim and his wife Karen, who were sitting at my patio table with their drinks, and introduced himself. Hey, I'm Evan, his son, he said, pointing at me. This is my girlfriend Sarah and my daughter Emma. Emma, can you say hi to Grandpa? The kid waved from her stroller and said something that might have been hi or might have been gibberish. Jim and Karen immediately went into grandparent mode, talking about how cute she was and asking how old she was. She's almost 2, Evan said, beaming like a proud father. This is actually her first time meeting Grandpa. We've been meaning to visit for a while. First, he told me I was in the neighborhood and saw the cars, acting casual. Then, to my guests, he flipped the script. We've been meaning to visit for a while now. Same visit, 2 different stories, one for me, one for the audience. I watched this performance with growing irritation. He was using the kid and the audience of my friends to create this wholesome family reunion scene, making it look like we were just a normal family who'd lost touch and were now reconnecting. The whole thing was calculated. Show up with the cute kid when there are witnesses around. Make it look like a natural family moment. Put me in a position where rejecting him also means rejecting an innocent toddler in front of people who don't know the full story. Jim turned to me with a smile. You didn't tell us you had a granddaughter, Rick. She's adorable. Before I could respond, Evan jumped in again. Then, Dad's always been modest about family stuff, but we're trying to spend more time together now that Emma's getting older. That was my breaking point. I set down my grill tongs and walked over to where they were standing. Actually, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, this is the first time I've seen Evan in over many years. We don't have a relationship, and I'm not this child's grandfather in any meaningful sense. The patio went dead silent. Sarah looked mortified. Even the kids seemed to sense the tension and got quiet. Dad, come on, Evan said, trying to salvage the situation. Don't make this awkward. I'm not making it awkward. You're the one who showed up uninvited and started introducing me to people as your daughter's grandfather when you haven't spoken to me in a decade. Sarah was already backing toward the gate, clearly wanting to escape whatever family drama she'd walked into. The other guests were pretending to be interested in their drinks while obviously listening to every word. Jim and Karen exchanged uncomfortable glances. A couple other conversations around the patio had stopped, and people were clearly listening. We should go, Sarah said quietly, already turning the stroller toward the gate. Evan gave me a look that was pure poison. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Like I was the one who just crashed someone else's party and started spinning fairy tales about family relationships. They left without another word. After they were gone, I had to explain the whole situation to my friends, which was exactly the kind of drama I'd been trying to avoid for years. Jim, being a good friend, just nodded and said, That's rough, man. Sorry you had to deal with that. But I could tell everyone was processing what they'd just witnessed. Some probably thought I was being harsh with a son who was trying to reconnect. Others might have understood that there was more to the story than what appeared on the surface. Either way, it reinforced something I'd already figured out. Evan only reached out when he needed something, and he was willing to manipulate situations to get it. In this case, he'd needed to project a stable family image, probably for legal reasons related to his ongoing court cases. Using his daughter as a prop in that performance was the most manipulative thing I'd seen him do yet. About a year later, I got an unexpected call from a guy named Pete Castellanos. He'd been an office manager for one of Greg's construction companies and had bought a storage unit at the auction when the feds liquidated Greg's assets. Found a box of files with your name on some documents, Pete told me. Figured you might want to see them before I toss everything. I was curious enough to drive across town and meet him at a coffee shop. Pete was a decent guy, mid-40s, who'd lost his job when Greg's operation collapsed, but hadn't been involved in any of the fraud. He handed me a banker's box full of random paperwork, contracts, invoices, and what looked like printed emails. Most of it's business stuff, he said, but there's some personal correspondence in there too. Thought you should know in case it's important. I thanked him and took the box home. Most of the contents were boring business documents, but buried near the bottom was a manila folder labeled Tara Personal. Turns out Greg had printed these emails at the office years ago, probably so he could coach Tara in person during work hours without leaving a trail on her end. And they ended up mixed in with company files that were boxed up and sent to the storage unit. Inside were printed email chains between Tara and Greg, dating back to my custody battle. Reading those emails was like watching a masterclass in manipulation and psychological warfare. The earliest email was from Tara to Greg, dated about 6 months after Greg started dating her. She was asking for advice on how to minimize Evan's attachment to his father during the custody transition. Greg's response was detailed and calculated. He suggested a strategy of making my visits less appealing by scheduling conflicting activities, encouraging Evan to bring friends to my house to create distractions, and gradually reframing my work travel as abandonment. But the worst part was how they coordinated Evan's testimony for the custody modification hearing. Tara had written detailed scripts for Evan to memorize about feeling unsafe and neglected during our visits. Greg coached him on specific phrases to use that would sound convincing to a family court judge. One email from Greg to Tara made my stomach turn. The kid's getting good at this. Had him practice the "dad cares more about work than me" line until it sounded natural. Judge will eat it up. They'd turned my 12-year-old son into an actor in their courtroom drama, teaching him to lie about our relationship to serve their agenda. The email chain continued for years, documenting their ongoing efforts to alienate Evan from me. They celebrated small victories. When Evan stopped asking about visiting me, when he agreed to change his last name, when he stopped mentioning me to friends at school. Greg bragged in one email about how much easier it was to parent effectively without me interfering. He wrote about molding Evan into someone who shared his values and priorities, treating my son like some kind of project to be completed. There were specific instructions about handling my attempts to maintain contact. Tara was supposed to screen all phone calls and make excuses for why Evan couldn't talk. If I suggested activities for our weekends together, she would pre-plan conflicting events that sounded more appealing. Key is to make him think his dad is boring and unreliable, Greg wrote in one email. Kid will naturally gravitate toward whoever makes his life more exciting. They even had strategies for handling gifts I sent. Instead of just keeping them, they would wait a few days and then have Evan donate them to charity, explaining that he didn't really need more stuff and preferred to help less fortunate kids. Made me look selfish for trying to buy his affection while they looked generous and socially conscious. The final email in the chain was from just before Evan turned 18. Tara was worried that once Evan became an adult, he might reconnect with me independently. Greg reassured her that the psychological conditioning was permanent and that Evan would never view me as anything more than a biological inconvenience. I sat in my kitchen reading those emails until 2 a.m., feeling a mix of rage and vindication. Rage because I finally understood the full scope of what they'd done to destroy my relationship with my son. Vindication because I now had proof that my instincts had been right all along. The alienation hadn't been natural or deserved. I made copies of everything and filed the originals in a safe deposit box. Part of me wanted to send them to Evan immediately, to show him how he'd been manipulated and used. But a bigger part of me realized it didn't matter anymore. Even if Evan saw those emails and understood what had happened, it wouldn't change the fact that he'd spent 16 years treating me like garbage. It wouldn't undo the missed birthdays, the name change, the decade of silence. It wouldn't restore the relationship we'd lost. The damage was done, and knowing who was responsible didn't make it hurt any less. 2 months after reading the emails, my phone lit up on a Tuesday night. Evan was calling, the first real phone conversation attempt in over a decade, despite those texts he'd sent a few months back. His voicemail was brief. "Dad, I need to talk. It's important. Call me." I didn't call back. 3 more voicemails followed over the next week, each one sounding more desperate than the last. Finally, he switched to email. The subject line was, "About the emails from Pete." Apparently, Pete had mentioned giving me the box of documents, and Evan had put 2 and 2 together. His email was longer than any communication I'd received from him since he was a teenager. He wrote about finding out that Greg and his mother had manipulated him during the custody battle, about realizing that his memories of me being absent or uncaring might not be accurate, about feeling confused and angry and not knowing what to believe anymore. "I don't know what's real," he wrote. "I have these memories of you not showing up, not caring, choosing work over me. But if Mom and Greg were lying about other things, maybe they were lying about that too. I need you to help me understand what actually happened." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and probably the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. But it still wasn't enough. Because even if Tara and Greg had planted the seeds, Evan had spent years watering them. He'd made the choice to cut me out completely as an adult. He'd made the choice to change his name. He'd made the choice to maintain zero contact for a decade. More importantly, his pattern of only reaching out when he needed something hadn't changed. He didn't contact me to rebuild our relationship or because he missed having a father. He contacted me because he was confused about his past and wanted me to help him sort through it. I was still just a resource to be used when convenient. I drafted about 6 different responses to his email over the course of 2 weeks. Some were angry, explaining exactly how much damage his choices had caused. Others were educational, walking through specific examples of how his treatment had affected me. One was even sympathetic, acknowledging how difficult it must be to realize you'd been manipulated. But in the end, I didn't send any of them, because the truth was simpler than all of that. I was done. Not angry, not bitter, just done. You can't rebuild a relationship with someone who only acknowledges you exist when their safety net collapses. You can't trust someone who spent years treating you like a stranger to suddenly become family again when it's convenient. Evan had made his choices for 16 years. He'd chosen Greg over me, chosen Tara's version of events over maintaining contact, chosen to erase me from his life completely. Those choices had consequences, and one of those consequences was that when his world fell apart, he had to face it without a father's support. I kept his email in my inbox for about a month, then moved it to a folder labeled Ancient History, along with all his other attempts at contact. Every few months, I get updates through Melanie about how he's doing. Apparently, he's got a steady job now, moved to a better apartment, even started dating someone new. I'm glad he's getting his life together. Genuinely. But his success or failure isn't my responsibility anymore, and his emotional healing isn't my job to facilitate. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not responding to his email, if I wonder what might have happened if I'd given him another chance. The answer is no. Some bridges get burned so thoroughly that trying to rebuild them just wastes everyone's time. Evan wanted me to explain what really happened during his childhood, to help him distinguish between real memories and manufactured ones. But the reality is that what really happened doesn't matter as much as what he chose to do about it as an adult. He chose to treat me like I didn't exist for years. So when his life got complicated and he needed a father figure to help him process his trauma, I chose to let him figure it out on his own. Seems fair to me.